Have you ever blamed yourself for something that wasn't entirely yours to carry? Rachel Moore had perfected the art of being everyone's safe harbor. At 35, she worked as a social worker at a community clinic in Cleveland, and her colleagues considered her indispensable. When a teenage mother didn't know what to do with her rebellious son, she called Rachel. When a colleague faced an impossible case, Rachel was the first name mentioned. She had this almost supernatural ability to stay calm while the world around her fell apart. Her voice never wavered, her eyes never judged, and her presence felt like solid ground in the middle of an earthquake. But inside, Rachel carried something nobody knew about. 13 years ago, when she was 22, her younger sister Lily had died in a car accident after a brutal argument between them. That night, Rachel had said something that played on repeat in her mind every single day since. If you want to destroy your life, go alone. Lily had stormed out, slammed the door, gotten in the car, and never came back. The police report didn't blame Rachel. The insurance didn't blame Rachel. Even her parents, Mark and Denise, never said the words out loud. But Rachel had sentenced herself the moment she got the phone call. The phrase that became her prison guard was simple and absolute. It was my fault. I pushed her. The years had passed, and Rachel had built what looked like a functional life. She finished her degree in social work, got a stable job, paid her bills, visited her parents on holidays, showed up well-dressed in family photos. But everything she did was governed by a secret pact: compensate for the guilt by helping everyone around her. She volunteered for extra shifts, answered work emails at 3 a.m, did grocery shopping for her parents, drove neighbors to doctor appointments. When someone called her an angel, she felt a bitter sting inside. She knew she was just trying to pay a debt that could never be settled. Rachel's silent pain had many layers. There was the guilt for the phrase she'd said in the heat of anger. There was the resentment that her parents never told her it wasn't her responsibility. They'd asked her to be strong at the funeral, and she'd swallowed her own grief to hold her mother while she sobbed. Since then, nobody had really asked how she felt. And there was the exhaustion of always being the strong one, the one who never broke, the one who had no right to fall apart because everyone depended on her. Recently, the exhaustion had started leaking through the cracks. Rachel developed constant headaches, insomnia, a tightness in her chest whenever she drove at night. She avoided intersections that looked anything like the one where Lily died, took longer routes home, told people it was traffic, when really it was her body remembering what she tried to forget. The paradox was suffocating. Rachel was an expert at putting other people's pain into words, but she couldn't name her own. She taught teenagers not to blame themselves for their parents' divorce. She consoled women who'd lost family members in unjust circumstances. But she believed with absolute certainty that what happened to Lily was, in fact, her fault. She gave to others exactly what nobody had ever given to her. The catalyst arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the clinic director, Monica Rivera, announced they'd be starting a weekly support group for young people who'd been through traumatic situations. Monica asked Rachel to co-facilitate the group alongside an invited therapist, Dr. Evelyn Brooks, a 58-year-old specialist in trauma. Rachel accepted by reflex. Of course, I can help. What she didn't imagine was that this group would force her own wound out of hiding. Rachel had heard of Dr. Brooks before. Colleagues spoke of her with a mix of respect and mystery. She wasn't the type to give motivational speeches or hand out self-help mantras. She was known for sitting in silence when everyone else rushed to fill the void, for asking questions that made people uncomfortable in the best way. Rachel felt a flicker of resistance when she read Evelyn's bio, something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the fear of being seen by someone who actually knew how to look. The first meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. Rachel prepared meticulously, as she always did, printed materials, arranged chairs in a circle, made sure there were tissues on the side table. When Dr. Evelyn Brooks walked in 20 minutes early, Rachel was surprised by her presence. She wasn't what Rachel expected. Evelyn was shorter than she'd imagined, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing simple jeans and a burgundy cardigan. Her eyes were kind but piercing, the kind that saw more than you wanted to show. They shook hands, and Evelyn said simply, "Thank you for doing this work." There was no small talk, no flattery, just presence. The first few sessions felt like walking on a tightrope for Rachel. She watched Evelyn's way of conducting the group and felt deeply uncomfortable. Instead of offering quick advice or consolation, Evelyn asked simple questions and then waited. She let silences stretch until someone felt ready to fill them. She didn't try to fix anyone. Rachel, whose entire survival strategy had been to fill voids, resolve quickly, and prevent people from staying too long in pain, found herself fidgeting in her seat. It went against everything her nervous system had learned to do since that night 13 years ago. The group consisted of 8 teenagers, each carrying their own invisible weight. There was Jasmine, who'd witnessed domestic violence her entire childhood. Marcus, whose father had died by suicide. Aaliyah, who'd been assaulted at a party and blamed herself for drinking. But the one who caught Rachel's attention from the very first session was Caleb, a 16-year-old with a hard stare, always wearing headphones around his neck, sitting with his arms crossed like armor. Caleb had lost his best friend in a shooting at a party, and every time he spoke, his words mirrored the ones Rachel had been repeating to herself for over a decade. "It was my fault. I'm the one who insisted we go. I dragged him out of his house. I killed him. I just didn't pull the trigger." Every time Caleb said those words, Rachel felt her body stiffen. Her hands would sweat. Her throat would tighten. It was like listening to her own voice from another lifetime, from that 22-year-old version of herself standing in the doorway as Lily slammed it shut. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he couldn't possibly carry that responsibility, but the words felt hollow in her mouth because she'd never believed them about herself. One stormy evening 3 weeks into the group, everything changed. Only 5 of the teens had shown up. The others were stuck in traffic or had last-minute obligations. The room felt smaller, more intimate, more dangerous. Caleb was particularly agitated that night. He kept shifting in his seat, his leg bouncing, his jaw clenched. When Evelyn asked him how his week had been, he exploded. He stood up abruptly, started pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his voice rising. "Nobody gets it," he said, his hands clenched into fists. "Nobody understands what it's like to carry a body in your conscience. To know that if you hadn't opened your mouth, hadn't been so stupid, someone would still be alive. You all sit here and talk about it's not your fault, like it's some kind of magic spell, but you don't know. You don't know what I did." Rachel felt her own pulse quicken. Her palms were damp. She could have been him in another age, in another body. She tried to respond with the logic she used at work, the professional voice she'd trained for years. She talked about external factors, about other people's choices, about the shooter's responsibility, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't landing. They weren't landing on Caleb because they had never landed, truly, on her. Evelyn didn't interrupt Rachel, but when Rachel finished, Evelyn asked everyone to sit in silence for a moment. The only sounds were the hum of the air conditioner and the rain hammering against the windows. Caleb eventually sat back down, breathing hard, his head in his hands. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, Evelyn spoke. Her voice was low, firm, and completely without drama. "Caleb," she said, and waited until he looked up at her. "What happened was tragic, but it is not a sentence on who you are. You were there, but you are not the guilty one. Responsible and guilty are not the same thing." She paused, then repeated slowly, as if each word needed to land separately. "You were there, but you are not the guilty one." It was a simple phrase, almost too simple, but the room shifted. Rachel felt something crack open inside her chest, something she'd kept sealed for 13 years. The phrase landed on her like it had been meant for her all along. "You were there, but you are not the guilty one. It was exactly what her soul had needed to hear and had never heard from anyone. Not from her father, not from her mother, not from any therapist, because she'd never told the whole story to anyone. Rachel's heart started racing. Her face felt hot. Every part of her wanted to resist the phrase, to argue that, in my case, it's different. In my case, I really did push. But at the same time, a very young part of her, the 22-year-old standing at that door, desperately wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, some small part of that phrase could also be for her. She held back tears by professional reflex, managed to finish the session, but walked out of the room feeling like something inside her had been dislodged. In the hallway, Evelyn called her by name. "Rachel," she said simply. "Are you okay?" Rachel gave the automatic answer. "I'm fine, just tired." Evelyn didn't push, but added, almost casually, "Sometimes, when a story hits us too hard, it's because there's something of ours in it." That observation opened a crack. For the first time in many years, Rachel realized that maybe she wasn't just tired. Maybe she was carrying a frozen pain that had never been allowed to thaw. The next few days were hell. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the phrase. It played on repeat in her mind, competing with the old script. It was my fault. I pushed her. She barely slept. At work, she found herself distracted, making small mistakes, forgetting to return a phone call, mixing up appointment times. She considered canceling her next session with the group, making up an excuse, but something stopped her. A small voice inside, quieter than the guilt but more persistent, whispered, "Maybe it's time." 3 days after that session, Rachel did something she'd never done before. She asked Evelyn if they could talk, just the two of them. Not a formal therapy session, just coffee at the diner across the street from the clinic. Evelyn agreed without hesitation, and they met on a gray Friday afternoon, the kind of day where the sky felt too low and the light too flat. Rachel ordered coffee she didn't drink. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the warm mug. She told the story she'd never told anyone in full. The fight with Lily, the phrase she'd said, the door slamming, the phone call at 2:47 a.m., the funeral where she'd held her mother and swallowed her own grief, the years of trying to compensate, the secret belief that she'd killed her sister with words. When she finished, she looked down at her untouched coffee, terrified to see judgment in Evelyn's eyes, the judgment she'd been carrying for herself all these years. But when she finally looked up, what she saw was not judgment. It was attention, deep, genuine attention, and no rush whatsoever. Evelyn breathed in slowly, then leaned forward slightly and spoke in the same calm, steady voice she'd used with Caleb. "Rachel," she said, "what you said that night was painful, but it was absolutely human. You didn't drive the car. You didn't choose the accident. You don't have that much power." She paused, then repeated the phrase with an addition that changed everything. "You were there, but you are not the guilty one, and you don't have that much power." Those last words landed like an earthquake. You don't have that much power. It was the complete inversion of Rachel's narrative. She had always seen herself as someone who could have prevented everything if only she'd said the right words. Now, for the first time, someone was inviting her to consider that she wasn't as powerful as her guilt had made her believe. It was a humiliation of the ego in the best sense, removing the fantasy of absolute control to give back her humanity. Evelyn continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You were 22 years old, angry and human. Lily made a choice to get in that car. The road was icy. A million factors came together in a tragedy. You were one small piece of a much larger picture, Rachel. You were there, but you were never the villain of this story." Rachel felt tears she'd been holding for 13 years start to break through. Not polite tears, not controlled tears, but the kind that come from somewhere ancient and buried. She cried in that diner booth while Evelyn sat across from her, not offering tissues or comfort words, just presence. When Rachel finally caught her breath, Evelyn said one more thing. The work now is to learn to forgive the 22-year-old who didn't know what we know now. She was doing the best she could. Can you give her that? The transformation wasn't instantaneous. Rachel didn't wake up cured. She still had days where she dreamed about Lily, where she still avoided certain intersections. But something fundamental had shifted in the internal structure. She started allowing herself to feel sadness without immediately converting it into service for others. She began regular therapy sessions with Evelyn, not as a colleague, but as a patient. She told close friends, for the first time, that she still struggled with guilt. In one of the most symbolic moments, she took the only photo of Lily she'd kept hidden in her nightstand drawer and placed it on a shelf in her living room. The photo stopped being an object of private punishment and became a memory of love. At work, Rachel noticed her way of attending to the young people changed subtly. Instead of trying to fix things quickly, she allowed a few more seconds of silence, as she'd watched Evelyn do. When a teenager said, "It was all my fault," she didn't respond with rushed rationalizations. She asked, "Who taught you that everything is your fault?" Her pain had started to serve not as a debt, but as a source of real empathy. Several months later, the family gathered at her parents' house for what would have been Lily's 30th birthday. Every year this date was tense, full of awkward silence and dishes washed too quickly. This time, Rachel decided to do something small but radical. Instead of pretending it was just another Sunday, she proposed a simple toast to her sister's memory. Her mother, on the verge of tears, murmured that sometimes she still blamed herself for letting Lily leave that night. Her father said, "If I hadn't argued with her, maybe." Rachel listened to all of it and realized that each of them had been clinging, for years, to their own form of silent guilt. She felt the urge to say, "It's my fault," but inside her echoed Evelyn's phrase. So she chose something different. "I think we all did the best we could with what we knew at the time," she said quietly. "We were there, but that doesn't make any of us guilty. We miss her, and that's different from carrying a sentence." Nobody hugged and cried in a melodramatic way. Nobody forgave themselves in a prepared speech. What happened was more subtle and, therefore, more real. Her father finally pronounced Lily's name without changing the subject immediately after. Her mother breathed easier. The evening passed without anyone escaping to their room early. Rachel went home feeling that, for the first time, her sister was being remembered not with the weight of condemnation, but with space for longing. In the final scene, back at the clinic, a new young person in the group said, eyes down, that he'd ruined everything in a situation with a friend. Rachel, now in the position of someone who had learned and was still learning, took a deep breath and offered the phrase she'd once received. "You were there, but that doesn't make you the villain of the story." She knew that for him, this phrase was just the beginning. But for anyone watching, it was clear. This was the same phrase that had once found Rachel at the exact point of her silent pain. Now, it was circulating, like a thread of quiet healing between people who believe themselves irredeemably guilty. The story ends not with a miracle, but with a profound shift. Rachel stopped defining herself by guilt and began relating to her own story from a place of humanity and compassion. And somewhere in Cleveland, in a small support group in a community clinic, a simple phrase continued to work its quiet magic, reminding tired souls that being present at a tragedy doesn't make you its author. This story reminds us that the words we deny ourselves are often the ones our soul needs most. Rachel spent 13 years believing she had the power to destroy a life with a single sentence, until someone showed her she didn't have that much power at all. Sometimes the heaviest thing we carry isn't what happened, but the story we tell ourselves about what happened. What guilt are you still carrying that was never fully yours to begin with? If this story touched something deep inside you, type the word "release" in the comments. Let me know you stayed until the end and that this message found you. Share what city you're watching from. Your story might inspire someone on their own journey. Subscribe and hit the bell because every week I share stories that can transform how you see yourself and your struggles. And remember, The phrase your soul needs might be closer than you think.